thank you for the gift of this day. We thank you for the breath we draw. We thank you for the life that you give and sustain us moment by moment. We thank you for the friends and family that you've given us in your Son and the way in which you supply us over and over with those that support and strengthen, who encourage and heal. And we ask that you'd be with us in this time together and that you'd be our help and our guide. We ask that you'd be with us as we turn weary minds to your Son's teaching. And we ask that you would give us insight, that you would give us eyes to see, ears to hear, a heart to understand, that as we attend to his teaching, that you would guide us into a deeper life. We ask in particular right now that through the word spoken and through the silences, that you'd be our one teacher from the heavens. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All righty. So we're going to be in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21 and following, and just remind everybody where we're at so far. We spent time kind of distinguishing and clarifying two questions. What's the good life? Who's the good person? And we saw that in Jesus' language, the response to the good life, what is often called the question of happiness, is what you're looking for there is the language of blessedness and of joy. Okay, we saw that it comes immediately, but not necessarily lastingly, with the experience of co-working with God or hearing from God. And it's simply that awareness of being caught up in something bigger than ourselves that brings with it a sense of well-being that can be there even in the midst of pain, of loss, of social exclusion. And so it's robust, but it's also ephemeral, oddly enough, okay? It comes quickly, it can go just as quickly, depending on what we're paying attention to, okay? So I find that description rather brilliant coming from Jesus, and that it's different from what we see other people trying to describe happiness as, but I find it to be rather realistic. That kind of matches my experience in some ways, right? I don't live in kind of undisturbed perpetual joy, okay? I have moments where I realize, okay, here we are together. and that brings joy, okay? And it's good, that's good. And those periods we can learn to live in them in more lasting ways, but that's the nature of it. Then the second thing we saw was his account of the good person. And we saw that this is centered around the life of a person who's coming to be fully functional in love. That's really the core of it. And that's something that happens from the inside out. And so that's how we are brought beyond the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. We said last time that the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees is to focus on the external behavior, the rules. And what goes beyond that actually is this focus on altering what's happening at the level of the heart. Okay, moving back to the level of motivation. And when that comes to be something that's overflowing with love, then we find that we automatically are doing the things that are right and good for others. But that happens without necessarily focusing a lot on the external rule. Okay. Now, what we're going to do for the next few sessions is we're going to look more deeply at these three states of heart. Jesus teaching about these three states of heart that are, they're the working points. Okay, they're the places where every human life gets derailed at some point. Okay? And they're what we're moving away from when we're moving towards a life of being fully functional in love. Okay? So the first of these is, in Jesus' teaching, anger and contempt. And what we said is that Jesus' teaching is consistent in always starting with anger issues when he's doing his, if I can put it this way, his negative ethic is what to avoid, right? He always starts with anger. And it's worth asking why. Now, we know from our last session one reason, and that is that he's bringing this out of the second tablet of the Ten Commandments, right? So behind murder, he sees a heart given over to anger, okay, and how that follows out. So there's a textual reason for anger coming first, but really that doesn't answer the question altogether, because you then also want to ask, well, why does the Father put it at the top of that second tablet, right? Why start with anger if you want to help renovate, to change a human life? And I think the reason is that more wrongdoing and harm in human life comes out of anger than out of anything else. Okay? And it's pretty easy to just kind of think about this to get a sense of the range of things that are rooted in anger. Okay? Why do husbands beat wives? Right? Why do sisters stop talking to each other? Why do churches split? Why is it that children grow up deprived of one parent or another? And you could go on and on. In the U.S., I don't know what the statistics are around this part of the world, but in the U.S., every year somewhere between 15, 16, 17,000 people are murdered. Okay? And then you have hundreds of thousands of aggravated assault cases, and you might just stop and ask, how many of those would happen without anger? Right? You might have one or two that, it's just for the insurance money or something. But in general, when you look at something that extreme behind it, there's anger that got out of control. Okay? And so Jesus starts with anger because the truth is that more wrongdoing, more harm in human life begins with anger than anything else. And it's not just, we can push this a little deeper, it's not just that the results of anger harm people. It's actually the case that anger itself is already something that hurts. Okay? And you know this intuitively already. If you were to find out I was angry at you, right? You've had this sort of thing, she's really mad at you, right? What happens is when you hear that, you're already hurt, right? And often because of that hurt, you're then angry back in response, right? So this is part of how this works in our life. And there's a reason for that. And it has to do with the nature of anger itself. You see, anger as an emotion, every emotion has a kind of built-in action that's natural to it, okay? And it's the nature of anger to want to harm its object. So whatever I'm angry at, the natural impulse is to want to hurt it, okay? And that's true whether it's a person or an inanimate object. So just think about it this way. We can move to inanimate objects for a moment because, it's easier for us to see without feeling guilty about, right? But you've had the experience, I'm sure, of getting up, in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom and hitting your foot on, on a piece of furniture, right? maybe you reorganize, whatever, but walking there and hit your little toe on the corner of a coffee table, and you feel pain, and the instant response, okay, to that pain is anger, right? At least, this is at least Daniel confessing, okay? Maybe y'all are above this. But, and what's the next thing that happens, okay? You want, at least, to break the thing that hurt you, right? You want to throw the chair out the window, turn over the coffee table, whatever it is. It's like instant. And you see, this is part of anger at one level is just a natural response to pain or to frustration. Okay, the frustration of one's will. And so, but with it, built into it, is this kind of impulse to want to hurt the thing that you're angry at. Okay? Now, that's one of the reasons that Jesus starts here with anger. Okay? Now, even though anger itself has a certain capacity to hurt, it's not in and of itself wrong. It's important to be clear about here. And Jesus is going to make a distinction. You have to pay attention to the grammar of what he says here to see it. But he's going to point to a kind of anger a step beyond what I call basic anger. Okay? So basic anger is this immediate response to pain, to frustration, and it's natural. All things being equal, it'd be better if we didn't have it maybe in some cases, right? But there's nothing wrong with it, okay? It's not morally wrong. Anger in itself is not morally wrong at this level of just basic anger, okay? But, I'll say this, and if all we had is basic anger, it would kind of blow up and be gone rather quickly. It just wouldn't last. And there may be some hurt from that, but it wouldn't fester, it wouldn't grow, okay? It wouldn't take over anybody's life. And so it's important that what happens here is that Jesus, when he deals with this, he begins a step beyond basic anger. He begins his moral evaluation with what I'm going to call retained anger. Okay? And so let's read this passage. So we're in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21, and we'll just read verses 21 and 22 to start with. Okay? And if somebody has that, if you can read it very loud, and I'll point my microphone towards you so it gets on the... No, just 21 and 22. We'll just take that part first.
You have heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment." But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, "You fool," will be liable to the hell of fire.
Okay, thank you. All right, now I'm gonna give you another translation here, okay? As we go through this, so I can point out some of the nuance, some of the distinctions that Jesus makes here. First, let me say this: we have this kind of classic pattern in Jesus where he starts with the prohibition, right? The negative prohibition, the "thou shalt not," out of the Ten Commandments, and then he begins to move to the level of the heart. Okay, so he's kind of he reads the Torah, the law, with X-ray vision. Okay, and what he sees behind the "thou shalt nots" is this heart that's pumping in poor ways. Okay, where there's wrong motivations in the heart. Now. So he says, you've heard it said, "You shall not murder. Whoever murders will be guilty in judgment. But I say to you," and now here's the translation I'll offer, "everyone who goes on being angry with his brother shall be guilty in judgment. Okay? The reason I'm translating it that way, so this is the first step. There's kind of three steps that Jesus traces out here. The first is retained anger. In other words, anger that I hold on to. And the reason I'm using that is because orizomenos, right, this is a, might give it a little longer there. This is a present participle. And what that means is that the present is significant because it's ongoing action. It's not about when it happens, it's about how long it happens, right? And so this is something that implies that it's retained. It's something that's going on. It's not just, and that's why a translation that says anybody who gets angry with his brother is guilty is just, it's inaccurate, okay? What he's saying here is he starts with anyone who goes on being angry, okay? Now, that's important because what this means is that Jesus begins his moral evaluation not just with the anger that kind of pops up like that, right? It's not the anger that happens when that hurt and all of a sudden I'm angry. You see, because that in itself, that's not morally wrong yet. Now, I have to figure out how to work with that still, but that's not morally wrong. Where it becomes morally wrong is this place where now I take some hurt, some reason for being angry, and I decide I'm going to hold on to it. Okay? I'm going to keep it fresh. I've got something against you. I've got this flame inside, and I'm going to pull it out at any moment now. Okay? I'm always ready now to blow up. And this is important because what he's pointing at is that this is the point, the retaining, the holding on to it, this is the point where it's chosen. Okay? And because of that, there's ethical significance, right? That's where it becomes morally wrong, it's there because I chose it. And this is also brilliant in terms of Jesus kind of putting his finger on something that the Greeks in general have missed. Okay? If you go back to the philosophers tended to deal with anger as a kind of madness that overtakes a person. Right? And they dealt with sexuality that way too, right? But this kind of, the rage that overtakes, the rage of Achilles and so forth, and it's like a kind of insanity. And so the person who does it, you might pity him or something like that, but it's almost beyond moral evaluation once it's happening is the idea, because it's just, you've lost your mind, right? But what Jesus points out here, and this is very important, and I think you'll recognize it if you look at your own experience, is that there's a sense in which this kind of anger, it's not just something that happens in me, it's something I do. In fact, sometimes anger is a strategy I have, right? There's this, it's a way I have of maybe feeling powerful, right? Of getting energy in a situation where otherwise I feel like, I'm ashamed or I'm tired or whatever, that sometimes I will use anger in order to almost like a stimulant, like caffeine, right? And it at that level, it can work a little bit, okay? It has all kinds of disastrous consequences for human life, but it does give energy for a moment, okay? Sometimes anger at this level, this retained anger, it's just a strategy for getting my way also. One of the things that many people learn, sometimes very early in life, is that if you get red in the face, if you shout, if maybe you stand over a person, right? Often that's enough for them to back down and just give you whatever you want. right? Because it brings with it a threat of physical violence, right? And often just that threat that's, implicit in the anger is enough for a person to get their way. And so what happens is, in human life, this kind of retained anger, it's something that we use as a strategy for all sorts of things. And essentially it's a way of, like all of these kind of three core problems at the heart, it's a strategy for making life work apart from God. Okay? It's a way for me to get something done without having to need God to do something to complete it. Okay? To make it happen. Now, let me also clarify one misconception before we move to the next step, because like I said, there's a progression here. So the first thing is Jesus starts with retained anger, chosen anger. The misconception that I want to set aside so we can think about this more clearly is that, especially in the West, we often talk about anger and, well, usually it's just anger and sexual desire, but we talk about it through kind of a hydraulic metaphor, if I can put it that way. Sorry for the technical term. Another way you could think of that is release or explode, right? Like you have a lot of steam or liquid under pressure, and if you don't turn the valve and let some out, then the whole thing's going to explode, right? And people will talk about venting, letting their anger out as being something that's good, because if you don't do that, the idea goes that eventually you'll just, and then the anger can become out of control. So people often talk about it that way, both anger and sexual desire. Now let me just point out, they don't talk about other emotions that way. And part of the problem with this particular metaphor, this way of thinking about emotion and anger, is that it just isn't how we actually think about emotion. And all you have to do is try substituting out an emotion, and you'll see how silly it is. Like, take gratitude. Okay? So, Vangelis, I'm really, really worried about you. Like, in fact, all of us are. Because you've been bottling up your gratitude. Like for years, people have been doing nice things for you, taking care of you in so many ways. And we can see you start, and then you stuff that gratitude down. And someday, if you don't start letting it out, somebody's going to do something nice for you, and it's going to be just gratitude everywhere, Can't hold it in, right? It's just not, we don't think about it that way, right? And so, and you can do this with any other emotion, and you find out that's just not how we think about emotion. That's not how we experience emotion, right? But when we talk about two in particular, about anger and about sexual desire, it's very common for us to use this, and it goes back, Freud and others. So this is a kind of a post-Freud thing in the West, but it's just not how it works. Okay. The second thing that we need to say, particularly with regard to anger, is that often what we call releasing or venting is actually rehearsing. You see, what happens if I kind of pull you to the side and I tell you everything that this person, and I'm, talk about this person and how I'm angry at this person, what I'm doing actually is I'm rehearsing what that anger is about. Okay? And that doesn't get rid of the anger, that just intensifies it over time. Now, let me be clear, it's not that there isn't a place for talking through this with somebody if you need guidance and all of that. Okay? But just venting is not actually helpful. Okay? And so part of what we have to do if we're going to work towards the resolution of anger is don't focus so much on the anger as what it is that the anger is about. Okay? Because for that anger to go away, you have to resolve what it's about. Okay? And that's a different focus, all right? But we'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so essentially here's what Jesus is going to tell us, okay? In the kingdom of God, in a life where I'm folded into God's project, I'm working with Him, and my own little projects now are not so important to me. I can let them, they can succeed or fail as long as what I'm doing with God, I know that will eventually succeed because God's the primary one doing it, okay? Within the kingdom, this is a tool I don't need. I can lay anger down, okay? That doesn't mean that there won't be moments where I'm angry and all of that, but I don't need retained anger. Okay? I can do life without it. Okay? Now, it's the nature of anger, once we retain it, once we choose to hold on to it, that it doesn't remain what it is. Okay? And so Jesus now takes us to the second step. So he says, he who goes on being angry with his brother will be guilty in the judgment. He who says to his brother, Racha, will be guilty before the Sanhedrin. So there's a progression there. And you'll notice that the level of guilt, so to speak, is increasing. Another way of saying what he's doing there is he's pointing out that the degree of harm to my brother is increasing. Okay? So what is this second degree, this intensification of harm that takes place with Racha? Racha, the reason it's not translated usually, it's just Racha still in your English translations, is because it's not actually a word as much as it is a sound. It's the sound of hawking up some spittle to spit in somebody's face, right? And so what you have here actually is simply a sign of contempt. And the truth is that contempt is more harmful. It's both a natural progression from anger that's held onto over time, and it's more damaging. It's more harmful to the other person than the anger itself. Okay, what's the difference? In anger, built into anger is I want to oppose you. I want to harm you even. Okay, but because of that, there's a sense in which we're equals if I'm angry with you. Right? You're an opponent. What becomes a natural progression, though, over time, if I hold on to it, is to get to the place where it's not like I want to oppose you, I want to hurt you. I start saying, not even worth the effort. You're beneath me. Right? That's what contempt is. So contempt is when I see another person as less than a person. Okay? As not worth helping or hurting even. Okay? And this kind and filthy language and cursing at a person is a basic sign of contempt. It's a way of saying you don't deserve the basic dignity of a person. Okay? And it does harm more than anger. It harms more than anger because it depersonalizes. Okay? Now, this is something that we also know experientially at a really basic level. And you've experienced it and you see it, for instance, often in interactions with between parents and children. Okay? Because what will happen, you get to, if a child feels like they're being held in contempt, it's not only parent and child, but this is one of the places you'll find it. If they feel like they're not being taken seriously, like they're not being honored as having a mind of their own and things worthwhile of their own, all that, if they feel like they're being held in contempt, it's a pretty natural response, really unreflectively, to try to anger the other person. Now think about that. Why, if I'm being held in contempt, would I want to anger that person? It's because if I anger that person, I get a promotion, right? Because when I'm angry, if you're angry at me, well, we're equals now. You know, I'm getting an effect out of you, right? But when I'm being held in contempt, that's more painful. And so I'll make you angry just to know I'm making a difference here, right? And so it's a very natural progression, okay? Both to move from anger to contempt when I'm holding on to that anger long term, like it just gets too hard to hold, and so I start thinking of the person in lower and lower terms as less than human. And second, it's more harmful to the other person. Okay. Now, the third level in this progression is that it moves towards what I'll call a fusion of anger and contempt. This mixture. So Jesus says, he who says to his brother, fool, right, will be guilty enough for the fires of Gehenna. Okay? Now, that word fool doesn't have the emotional weight in English in our world that it does in Jesus' world. Okay? If you want to understand what fool means, read the Proverbs. Okay? Because the fool is the person that's perniciously incompetent, right? It's the person that, it's not just, he or she's not just stupid, right? But is kind of an enemy to the whole community in such a way that person brings heartache and destruction to everybody around them. And when you read the Proverbs, the best thing you can do with a fool is just beat them. But even that probably won't work. Okay? You're probably wasting your effort at it, but beat them. And that's what you see in this kind of conventional wisdom. So when you move in this third step to you fool, what we're talking about is the person who's almost not a person anymore, a contemptible being, and we're now adding anger to that. Now here's the thing. Once we've moved from retained anger to contempt and added anger back into the situation, the only thing that is missing for physical violence is the occasion. That's it. Everything inside of me that leads up to the threshold of thou shalt not kill, right, to the actual murder, is there, except perhaps the right occasion. Okay? If I don't kill at this point, if this is what's going on inside of me in my relation with somebody, then, it's just good luck. It's not because I'm not morally ready to do it. Okay? And so what Jesus does here is he unfolds everything that's going on in the deep layers of the heart that lead up to that forbidden action, thou shalt not murder. Okay? Now, so Jesus kind of unveils for us what's going on at the heart level. He gives us this x-ray, this heart x-ray. But then he also offers us a way forward, and this is important. So we have two kind of illustrations, if I can put it that way, of a new kind of heart, what it might look like if we laid down anger and contempt and we interacted with our neighbor in a different way. And so the first is, actually, let me say a word about this. So these are in verses 23 through 26. And what I need to point out is two things. First of all, these are not laws. Okay? If you turn these into laws, then they become silly, right? And they just don't work. and they also you start to lose the meaning of it. Instead, what Jesus is doing is he's offering illustrations that are so stark, right, that they're designed to make us ask a question. And the question is this: what kind of person, what sort of heart would behave in that way, would do this? Okay? And the answer to that question, when we kind of meditate on these examples, these illustrations, is the point that Jesus is trying to get across. Okay? So they're illustrations, not laws. And when we hear it, we're supposed to ask, what kind of person would do that? All right? So let's read these. So verses 23 and 24. Somebody read it nice and loud for us. Matthew 5, 23 and 24.
Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift.
Okay, thank you. So the scenario is you're in the temple, you're bringing your gift to the altar, and as you're bringing it there, you remember a brother that has something against you. It's not even that you have something against that person, but that person has something against you. Okay? And so you leave it, you go to resolve it, okay, on the spot. Now, what's the question we ask? That's right. What kind of person would do this? Okay? And the first thing that you want to notice is that, first of all, this is so shocking because in Jesus' world, you never interrupt a sacrifice, right? And the only way it could be interrupted is for something more important. And so what Jesus essentially is saying is that my brother who's angry with me is more important. That situation is more important than my sacrifice at the altar in the temple. Okay, so now how could one value one's brother in his or her in his anger, right? More than this sacrifice at the temple? Well, you'd have to have a very, very high regard, a sense of the value of another person, and a sense of the pain and the damage that this retained anger is doing in that person, right? And so there's a sense of just kind of meditation on the value of other persons that is built into this. Jesus' way would be one in which a person would be thinking of other people with that kind of elevated care. Okay? At least that. I'm sure there's more, and we can kind of process this and think about it. Okay? But he gives a second kind of stark illustration. And so somebody read for us verses 25 and 26.
Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny.
Thank you. Okay, so this one he says, you're on your way to court because somebody's dragging you off to sue you. Right? Which, by the way, just in Jesus' world, there's no reason we should assume that means that there's guilt just because if the likelihood is that you're going to end up, in jail and fined and all of that, because corruption's everywhere, right? But you're being dragged off. Here's somebody who's trying to take things from you. And what he says quite literally at the beginning of 25 is be kindly minded. Kindly minded, well disposed towards this other person. Now, what's the question we ask? What
kind of person would do this?
What kind of, yeah, who would do that, right? And what you notice here is that it would be a person that has almost the opposite reflex to what's normal. Because if somebody's trying to hurt me and take something away from me, what's the typical response between human beings? Like, I'm going to harden up, right? I may have to interact with you, but you're not getting anywhere near my feelings, what I care, right? But this he describes as almost a kind of a tenderness and openness to the other person as a person, even in the midst of this person trying to take something away, right? And what that means is that there's a kind of built-in, at this point, a readiness to forgive. A readiness to forgive. You could think about it this way. Maybe just in the same way that we've carried around anger as something that's stored up and ready to use at any moment, that within the kingdom of God, as we follow in Jesus' way, it may become possible for us to carry around a readiness to forgive in the same way. That I may grow with Jesus to the point where I could be such a talented forgiver that, before you hurt me, I'm ready to forgive you. Okay? So this is a very different way of interacting with people. From within the kingdom, then it's possible to have this genuine desire to help persons, even persons that otherwise would be trying to harm you. Now, in life by my own power, I can't do that. Okay? Because, and what stops me is always this question, but if I don't strike out, if I don't, scare this person, what's going to happen to me? Who's going to take care of me? But within the kingdom, I can become strong enough and safe enough to think, hey, what's good for this person, even in this scenario? When I think of this, there's a little story in 2 Kings that I love that comes to mind. Okay, and I'll end with this because I think it's a good image for this way in which Jesus sees the possibility of living above anger and contempt. I think it's the Arameans they raid over and over in Israel, and so in 2 Kings chapter 6, what happens is that every time they try to raid, Israel's ready for them. Eventually that gets back to the courtroom of the king in Syria, in Aramea, and he wants to know, okay, who's the traitor? Because they always know we're coming, right? And he's told, no, actually, it's not that. It's that there's this prophet, right? And Elisha. And whatever you say in your, you whisper in your inner chamber, he can tell the king of Israel. And so the king of the Arameans decides, well, let's fix this. Let's go to the root of it. Let's go get Elisha, right? And so in 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 8 and following, there's this episode where they come out and they surround the city where Elisha is. And when his servant wakes up, he looks out and he freaks out. Oh my goodness, the hills are surrounded. Right? And Elisha prays and he says, Lord, open his eyes. And then what he sees beyond the Arameans around the city is this other army. Okay, this heavenly army that's there. And he says, there's more with us than with them. He prays, they're struck blind. He leads them into Samaria, right? And what happens at the end of this episode is when he gets this army now blind into Samaria, the king of Samaria says, do I kill him now? Right? Now, can I kill him? And what Elisha says is that how you would treat a guest? Right? And so instead of killing him, he spreads a feast and he takes care of these people who had come to raid. Right? And it's really beautiful because you get to the end of that and there's just this little line at the end. It says, and the Arameans, the raids ceased. Okay? Instead of responding in kind, they blessed that person from the strength of life in God's kingdom, and the hostility ended. Okay. All right. So here's the progression that is natural in human life, and then a couple illustrations from Jesus of a way to move beyond it in the kingdom. All right. Okay. Questions, comments?